Okay, hello. Hi, Chris, and congratulations on your Distinguished Contribution Prize from BISA. As you know, BISA has asked me to sort of talk about your career and the things that you've done during it. So what I thought I would start off with is the very beginning. You initially trained as a historian, and I'm wondering if you could just talk to us how you made the transition from the study of history to the study of international relations.
Indeed, yes. It seems a long time ago now, Karen. And of course, I was 21, and at that age, you're still really just groping around to know what you're interested in. But I did a history degree at Oxford. I was very interested in history, although the course was only intermittently satisfying. I was mostly interested in the modern history, and I did a special subject on the making of the Entente policy before the First World War. And I was disappointed with quite a lot of the historical writing, which was quite understandably very detailed archival work. But I was enthused by two particular books. One was by Zara Steiner, who was actually at Cambridge, and I subsequently met later on in my life, on basically the Foreign Office and British foreign policy. And she was interested in the making of foreign policy, although she didn't use theoretical or even analytical categories very much. And also then Sam Williamson's book, The Politics of Grand Strategy, which definitely took a bigger explanatory approach towards trying to understand why Britain and how Britain had got into the First World War. Then I suppose probably for kind of family and psychological reasons, I was particularly interested in the Second World War and how it was that only 20 years after the pity of war, the Great War, the bloodletting of 1914 to 18, we had got into yet another war. Not that I thought that the Second World War wasn't a just war or possibly inevitable in the circumstances by the late 30s, but it was still obviously the consequence of some massive errors of policy. And whereas the historians seemed basically still interested in a great political and normative shouting match about who were the appeasers and who were not, and how wicked the appeasers were, and so on. That seemed to me to be very simple-minded. And so I think I was becoming a kind of positivist avant la lettre, in the sense of I simply wanted to try and clear the ground and find out actually what had happened and who made what decisions, who was responsible for what. And so somehow I realized that I needed to do political science rather than history. So I was fortunate enough to get a scholarship to go to Nuffield College to do postgraduate work. And they were very good. They got me a bespoke program. There was a two-year MPhil in politics. Of course, it wasn't political science. This was Oxford in the early 1970s. It was highly institutional and political theory biased. Well, that was fine by me. And they constructed a kind of 1 year crash course in political sociology, public administration, and political philosophy, which I did with considerable pleasure, knowing that I then wanted to go on to do a PhD on how British foreign policy was made at the end of the 30s. And so after a year, I transferred to that, and I then did become an archival researcher for a year, going down to the Public Record Office near LSE as it there was, for a year to collect my material. And so I started writing the thesis. And at that point, I was fortunate enough to discover William Wallace. My own supervisor, Lord Belloff, was kind of positive but remote. And also we were on rather different political tracks at that time. And he said, and I became interested through some fellow students at Nuffield in the work of Graham Allison on Essence of Decision, which a book had just come out in 1971. And so this seemed to me to be really very insightful. Lord Belloff thought that was really a lot of kind of American jargon-ridden political science, and he didn't. But he did have the grace to send me to William Wallace, who was a young lecturer at Manchester, and William was also interested in it. And so at that point, I started to realize there was something called foreign policy analysis. But really, if you look at it, if I look back on it, I think really I was, doing more political science and international relations. I mean, international relations didn't exist as a subject at Oxford, except as a historical course in the undergraduate PPE degree, and as an MPhil, where I met, fortunately for me, Miles Kaler, who is professor that you may know at American University now, was at San Diego, and this remains a good friend. And Keith Banting, who became professor at Queen's in Canada. And between their insights and William Wallace's, I was basically doing decision-making. I was studying decision-making. Still didn't realize I was doing international relations. Nobody else at Oxford did that. And it was only when my 3 years as a graduate student were up and I hadn't finished my PhD and I had to try and cast around to do something, that I was fortunate enough to get what was effectively a kind of 1-year junior research fellowship at LSE, the Noel Buxton studentship. And that was in the Department of International Relations. Well, that was quite an eye-opener for me to go to LSE and see what courses were being put on in international relations, and to meet Geoffrey Goodwin and James Mayle and others. And so I realized I had a lot of getting up to speed to do, especially as they started to encourage me to do a little teaching. And then I applied, to my surprise, for a job I was encouraged to apply for a job in international relations in the department. To an even greater surprise, I got it because I still hadn't finished my DPhil. I was too busy finding out about international relations, and in those days it was easier, frankly. So there you are. I found myself teaching international relations about 3 weeks ahead of the students. Although by that time I'd done a lot of reading in the early subject of foreign policy analysis, because it hadn't really taken off, despite the fact that Snyder, Brooke and Sapin had sort of kicked it off in the late 50s. And at least I did know more about that than anyone else, probably, including some of the LSE staff at the time. And I wrote an article in Millennium called The Credentials of Foreign Policy Analysis, which might have got me the job.
Great. Well, I certainly, speaking on behalf of LSE, we're very happy that you were with us for so many years. I mean, you've just mentioned quite a few names that are big in the field of sort of European studies, and so you were initially then interested in British foreign policy making.
Yes.
How did you then come to be interested in European foreign policy, and particularly in those days when it was hardly existed?
Indeed. Now, you have to remember the political context. So I went to Nuffield in 1970. I went to LSE in 1973, which was the year in which Britain was accepted into the European Economic Community. There was a referendum in 1975. So these issues were, swirling around. And I was very interested in politics by this time. My wife had pushed me leftwards from a rather agnostic, or possibly even very early Heathite conservative position. And although Heath, of course, was pro-EU, and in going further left politically, I found myself opposed at that time to joining the EU. In fact, I voted no in the referendum of 1975 on socialist.
That's a secret I did not know.
Well, there are not many secrets, but that's one of them. I've never actually kept it completely quiet. But it was a standard socialist analysis that this was, the market going to be the market for big corporations, and it wasn't going to help working people. It was the miners' strike as well. No, it wasn't. Yeah, it was the miners' strike, 73, 74, and the Heathite government brought down by the miners and so on. And I was very keen on helping them in my small way. But anyway, after that, we were in after 1975. It was a bit like 2016. You accepted the result, and I mean, it was an overwhelming result. It was 2-1. It wasn't like 52-48. So there was no question of not accepting it. And at that point, Geoffrey Goodwin had an influence on me, because he wrote an article on something which was beginning to appear, which was, as you know well, European political cooperation. And Britain was actually, of course, present at the creation of that and was allowed to join in on the consultations for foreign policy coordination even before joining. And so that seemed to me a very interesting new context for British foreign policy. And I started to study it a bit. And once again, Wallace was very helpful. He encouraged me to get involved in various working groups that he was involved in. Eventually, I went to Chatham House for a year to work on it, and I met John Vincent there for the first time, who was working on human rights and foreign policy, and we struck up a good friendship. And I started to go to meetings in Germany, particularly organized by Wolfgang Wessels and Reinhard Rummel. And you're, of course, well aware from your own work about all that. And so that was quite an exciting time. I mean, it looked as if there really was going to be a way of trying to provide a solid European view of the world, which was not anti-American, but which was certainly different from the Americans. And this was in the aftermath of the Vietnam War, of course, when Europeans had no way of collectively expressing their resistance to and concerns about the Vietnam War. And so it seemed to me to be an excellent idea to go down that route. And, there was no particular opposition in Britain to it because it was coordination. It was highly intergovernmental. It seemed to be adding a greater sort of strength to Britain's position, a better platform for British foreign policy. So gradually I was getting into different streams. I was learning general international relations, beginning to, think of how the international system worked. I was thinking about the European community as a new framework for foreign policy, but I was still interested in British foreign policy. And I did finally finish my DPhil in 1978, and so that was good. But I then made one big mistake. I mean, in terms of trying to give advice to young researchers, I then breathed a sigh of relief at having finished my DPhil, put it on one side, and got interested in all the European stuff. And I should have immediately turned my DPhil into a book, because although it wasn't the best designed DPhil and it had to be finished rather quickly, it did contain a lot of, if I say it myself, rather good original research from the archives. And I did have an analytical model, which I had to eventually come back and rethink, 7 or 8 years later when I published it in different form and with more research, it has to be said. But
yeah. I mean, I do certainly encourage my own students to, you've just written a book.
Yeah.
And so now publish it.
Get it out
because it's going to be the easiest book you'll ever publish, because it's mostly done. So very good advice. So looking back, sort of, I don't want to say anything about age or anything, but that's a good few decades of experience working in both international relations with a kind of a historical bent, the European foreign policy, British foreign policy analysis. And so I just want to ask, a couple of questions, I guess, about how you view the development of the disciplines over that time. And just starting with international relations, which you came to, almost stumbled into. How do you see that the subject of international relations having changed over this quite an extensive period of time? But
a long period of time. Well, in terms of relationships with history, I think by and large the developments have been positive. When I first joined LSE, there were kind of constant sparring between international historians and international relations. They were more antagonistic to us than we were to them, because most of us had a historical interest, but they regarded us as kind of doing higher journalism. But all that changed both within the LSE and more broadly. It was complicated by the fact that, of course, that American political science, which was becoming increasingly influential in Britain, was also rather ahistorical, and in some respects remains so. And so that if you wanted to do proper political science, you weren't going to be regarded very well if you did it from a strongly historical perspective. Now, I think most people who do international relations think that without an understanding of history, you're doing it with both arms tied behind your back, really. And indeed, we've seen a strong move in this country, particularly towards historical sociology, and in Cambridge, where I am at the moment, is particularly strong on that. That you must understand international relations and indeed politics primarily through a historical lens, which I think actually is going a bit too far. I mean, I'm not against it. Obviously, I think that our subject should be a very broad church and thousand flowers bloom and all the rest of it. But I think that at the same time, we need to have theory and we need analytical concepts in order to sort out all the different strands of the things that are going on. We need to, in other words, need to have some interest in causal explanation. And I think that we've had, apart from that historical set of issues, we've had a tendency to perhaps, go too far on the other wing into interested in theory, epistemology, meta theory, and a kind of inward-looking quality to the subject has sometimes developed, which means that we can't easily speak to the outside world, despite the ref telling us that we must engage in outreach and impact and all the rest of it. We can tick the boxes, but actually, do we speak to the outside world? And does the outside world listen to us? There are various problems there, which are not just our fault as academics either. But I think that there have been very positive developments in the subject. International relations has grown hugely. I think one of the things I feel proudest about in my career is that I've made some small contribution in this country to it growing in terms of numbers and seriousness and people accepting it as an important intellectual activity. But at the same time, it hasn't necessarily, as Fred Halliday once said, our books may be good, but how many people in other disciplines cite them, in the newspapers or on TV or whatever, and somehow we've not quite managed to get ourselves recognized. But it's a long process. And I think the fact, as Michael Donnellan, our ex-colleague at LSE, once said 30 years or so ago, well, now everybody wants to do the international now. So don't think that you're going to have a nice sort of intellectual frontier around the subject. We are invaded. Now, that's inevitable and possibly a very good thing, but it means our distinctive contribution may become more blurred.
Yeah. I mean, that's certainly noticeable in terms of talking about for example, the Russian invasion on Ukraine. How many op-eds and opinion pieces in the media are not written by IR specialists? They're written by historians, by and large. Just in terms of theory and IR theory, coming back to that, how do you view the growth of theory in international relations?
Well, there are so many different kinds of theory, aren't there? And I think that the English school, which was strong at LSE, and I joined a group which James Mayle and Philip Windsor and others outside the LSE Michael Donnellan were involved in, was trying to link up ideas about the state which derive from classical political theory to international relations and to develop them. And I think that was Cornelia Navari was active in all that. That was quite a creative development. And now I think political philosophy has certainly taken on the problems of international relations. I mean, Stanley Hoffman, of course, was doing it at Harvard. So there are plenty of people, Michael Walzer and others. And so that now has become a very healthy and distinctive area. And who in political theory now doesn't think about certain major international issues, whether it's climate, poverty, and so on. So all that is very good. That's one kind of thing. Then there is the sort of theory that you use if you're a positivist political scientist, in which our students are all told that they must have a hypothesis, they must test that hypothesis, and so on, and they must use proper data and all the rest of it. That is also an important scholarly discipline. But in my view, the kind of products of that sort of investigation have been quite limited. I mean, the good products have been quite. There have been a huge number of products, but I mean, the actual insights created by the wages of war and the rest of it, these sort of big N studies have been relatively limited. Within foreign policy analysis, of course, I think theory has been immensely important. They're middle-range theories. What they don't do is to provide a single overarching structure for understanding the world, but they have developed out of the level of analysis debate. And I think, unfortunately, in international relations, that intellectual ambition has sometimes overreached itself because a lot of very clever people do want to, understandably, provide a theory of international relations, and the great debate with Ken Waltz was part of all that. And of course, Waltz himself was very parsimonious and limited his explanation of the world according to the kind of theory that he was constructing. But we still get an awful lot of stuff which is about the system as a whole, which is important and useful. And the English school was part of that, indeed. But I think we also need to take things down a step or two. And my own work has engaged, a bit with these issues of structure and agency, and how the people, the units in the system actually are affected by the environment that they have and how they shape that environment. And in a way, constructivism has been quite a positive development in that sense. Well, positive, the wrong word, but a creative development, because it has enabled us to think about how we might understand our world, frame it according to the kind of people we are, essentially the kind of cultures, societies we are. But that too can go too far in assuming that, as Chris Brown has often said, it's ideas all the way down. Well, it isn't ideas all the way down, actually. It's ideas are pretty. If we look at the Ukraine war now, we can see that Putin's ideas about what kind of Russia and Kirill and all the rest of it are profoundly important. But also what matters is the actual products of history on the ground, the geography, the imbalance of strength, the size of Russia and so on. If Russia was the size of Armenia, this conflict would be a very different matter. So it's as you know very well, it's a complex matter of trying to understand the interlinks between different levels and forces at operation simultaneously. So in that sense, my historian's background is still very much there. There is a certain skepticism about overarching single factor explanations.
In terms of sort of future development then of foreign policy analysis, of international relations, where do you think we should go? I mean, what sort of major questions and issues? I mean, you've mentioned the sort of that looking much more at the middle level of theorizing. Any major issues or questions you think really need answering that you don't see that we're addressing?
I think we are addressing most of the important questions, and I think, and this is again, there's an element of sort of conservatism with a small c in my approach. I don't think that we should be constantly seduced by the idea of the new, that there must be something better over the horizon, and that we can. That's how foreign policy analysis suffered in the 1990s during the wave of interest in globalization and so on. It wasn't just that. People said, "Oh, we've done that. It's not. We know that. We don't. There's nothing to do anymore." I mean, I found that profoundly mistaken, because first of all, it neglected the inevitable importance of the state. But secondly, we'd only done a certain amount of limited work on American foreign policy by and large, and not applied it to the vast range of different countries and cultures that there are in the world. And we're now beginning to get around that. There's been a lot more work done on small states, for example, and I think that's highly encouraging, and states of different kind, like Rob Litvak at Washington called states like North Korea outlier states. Well, outliers to what? So that brings you back into the international system and a relationship between the dominant norms and the individual strategies and concerns that particular countries have. But I think I've always been particularly interested in the interaction between domestic politics. And this does take me back to my Oxford studies as basically a student of public opinion. In fact, that was one bit of my doctorate that I never got around to publishing. But I think that we need to understand that foreign policy is a profoundly political and indeed social activity. And because the people, quote unquote, have not been much involved in it historically, we have neglected that dimension. But understandings of what kind of society we are, I think, have indeed profoundly shaped our foreign policy, even when it was being made by an elite. And we now see this, more clearly in the British context, with discussions about our identity and, whether we're post-imperial in some way, and indeed whether it goes two ways. So I think the big neglected area is how foreign policy shapes domestic politics. And that has been written about by some people, but there is a lot more to do. And I would like to see also much more analysis of the role. This is a very traditional question, but the role of institutions in terms of the accountability mechanisms of foreign policy, what happens, what is possible, and so on. But I wouldn't suggest for a moment that, these are the only questions to ask in the study of international relations. But I am prepared to go to the barricades for the view that it is an extremely important, indeed indispensable part of studying international policy.
Great, thank you. So just one last question to wrap up the interview. Anyone who's read your work, I think, has to be struck by the elegance of your writing. You certainly, and I worked with you as you've been my, an editor of various things that I've written or that we've done together. And certainly you approach writing as a craft. And I'm just wondering how you came about doing that. Was it taught to you? How do you approach writing? Not just sort of what you're writing about, but the actual technique, not necessarily just technique, perhaps the art of writing.
It's a very interesting question, and thank you for the compliment, which pleases me greatly, because I've always thought that writing well was very, very important. I think that unless you can express complex ideas or analyses clearly, you're not doing your job, and it reflects the fact that your own thinking is quite possibly muddled as well. So there is a very intimate relationship between writing well and thinking clearly, and it's two-way. It's mutually constitutive, as we say. This goes back a long way. When I went to primary school, we were all encouraged to just write from the moment we could write. And that was what you did in those days. And so I loved writing stories and lots of things. I must also give credit to my dad, who was a history teacher and a lover of poetry, and I think wrote rather well himself, although in a limited sort of way. But and I enjoyed English literature at school. In fact, I nearly studied it as an undergraduate, and I still take great pleasure in reading novels and poetry. And I think the rhythm of language is extremely important. I sometimes baffle students even today by saying, read what you've written aloud, even if it's only a paragraph or two, and you will see why you need a full stop there rather than a comma. Because pauses can be unnatural to do with the flow of the logic, but also the rhythm of the language. But as you say, writing is a craft, and therefore, we have all just written something bang straight out in a hurry, and it's had to go out. With experience, you get better at doing that, but it's not the ideal method. You need to be able to draft and redraft, but you also need to know when to be able to stop, because especially with a computer, with cut and paste, it becomes much, much more difficult. It's quicker, but you can often just confuse yourself, you can repeat things terribly. And it's very important. I still print up the things that I've written on the computer before I submit them, and put them aside for, often, if it's an important thing, I will put it aside for a day or two and come back to it, and you see it in a slightly different light. And of course, we all benefit from getting friends and colleagues and partners to read our stuff, and I must, give credit to my wife, Maria, who is the only person who's ever read everything I've written. Well, she probably hasn't read absolutely everything, but I mean, she's sacrificed some of her time to do that, and I've much benefited from her advice on these things. So writing is an interactive business. It's about an audience, isn't it? So you've got to think of your audience all the time. But I would also say, and the students do sometimes look at me as if I'm mad when I say this, just go and read some poetry, and feel language as a living thing.
Yeah, good for the soul too.
And great novels too. Yeah. But it's not just, it is good for the soul, but it's also understanding how masters of the craft have used language very carefully. We are now 100 years from T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland, for example, which is, has its flaws, but you can see how carefully it was constructed. Words have meanings.
Indeed. All right. Well, thank you very much, Chris, for having this discussion. I'm sure it's going to be a great interest to BISA members in the wider public. And again, very, very hearty congratulations for being awarded the Distinguished Contribution Prize from BISA. So we'll just stop this recording now. And I'll thank you very much for joining us.
I very much enjoyed talking to you, as always. Thank you.
As always. Right. Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.